I'm now delighted to bring to you the first panel of the day, The Diary of Manu Gandhi. The panel is based on the book by Tridip Suhrud, who is a writer, political scientist, cultural historian, and translator from Gujarat. After working for 5 years with Sabarmati Ashram as a director, he resigned in August 2017 and was later appointed as professor and director of CEPT archives. He received the Katha Award in 1999 and Sahitya Academy's Translation Prize in 2009 for his translated work Harilal Gandhi Alive. The session will be moderated by Ashish Nandi, who's a noted sociologist and clinical psychologist and has, over the years, strayed into areas outside formal social sciences and normal academic concerns. His research interests center on the political psychology of violence, cultures of knowledge, utopias and visions, human potentialities and futures. He received the Fukuoka Asian Culture Prize in 2007 and the Hans Killian Award in 2019. We are delighted to have among us the panelists, Ananya Vajpayee, who is a fellow and associate professor at CSTS, New Delhi. She works at the intersection of intellectual history, political theory, and critical philology. Her book, Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, won the 41st Thomas J. Wilson Memorial Prize from Harvard University Press, the Crossword Award for Nonfiction, and the Tata First Book Prize for Nonfiction. Harmony Siganporia, who teaches in the area of culture and communication at MICA, she has a PhD in social history. She's a practicing musician, and her research interests include gender and performativity, culture and conflict, semiotic theory, and modern Indian history. Sudhir Chandra, who's the author of Gandhi, An Impossible Possibility, and editor of Violence and Nonviolence Across Time, Religion, Culture, and History. And he's currently engaged with the question of possibility of nonviolence in today's world. He has been associated with various academic institutions in India and abroad. May I now request the panelists to please come on the stage? Thank you.
Here we are. It is a pleasure chairing this meeting, and we have it's also a pleasure to listen to Tridip Suhrud, who has done pioneering work in making Gandhi accessible to the academic world, not only outside India, but within India too. It is customary in the whole of South Asia to say that a person doesn't need an introduction, then speak half an hour as an introduction. I will avoid that temptation, and I will just point out that the kind of work he has done is extremely painstaking and taken him years. It is a work not often directed towards the laity. It is not something which you can read in your free evenings as an entertainment, but it is a work which will be used by scholars, particularly scholars interested in Gandhi and his world over the years and perhaps over the generations. And I do congratulate him on producing this particular book, because a quick glance at it, I should say, convinces me that Manuben's diary is also full of, it is more probably at times written as a part of a duty which she has set herself on self. And it is full of the kind of trivia which scholars will often ignore, but which can be very useful for somebody who is working on the inner world of Gandhi and his associates. And it gives me great pleasure to have 3 commentators who can take on Suhrud's challenge and make something out of this diary. I would personally be grateful to get clues as to what that diary conveys over Gandhi's world and its inner workings and inner dynamics. That's that.
Thank you, greatly honored Professor Nandi. Thank you, Oxford. A 14-year-old Manu decided to wear a sari and court arrest. She hoped that her tender age would not be noticed by the police when they arrested her in Wardha. And she was right. At the age of 14, in 1942, Manu is arrested and a new journey began. Mahadev had died in the Aga Khan Palace prison. Kasturba lay incapacitated, waiting for her death, and Manu is transferred as a prisoner to be a nurse to Aga Khan in 1943. She had been part of Gandhi's universe, Gandhi's ashram, performing little acts of service, as they were called. But her real education began when she entered the Aga Khan Palace. It was a strange group there. There was ailing Ba. There was Bapu mourning Mahadev's death and the inevitability of violence that was to surround him. He had just fasted to no effect, perhaps, to the world outside. Most people in the world outside did not even know that Gandhi had undergone a long fast as a prisoner. There was Sushila Nair, already a doctor, and her brother Pyarelal, who, after Mahadev's death, had become the primary secretarial assistant to Gandhi. Then there was Meera, Madeline Slade, almost on the fringes of the group. And then there were these two government officials, a doctor and the jailer, and the people who were brought in from the neighboring Yeravda to look after the estate. So that's really where the diaries begin. 11th April 1943 is the first entry. And what is the nature of the diary? That's one. What are these diaries doing? How did we come upon them? And what do they tell us about Gandhi's last years? These are the 3 or 4 things that I wish to touch upon. For Gandhi, the act of writing a diary was essential to be a satyagrahi and therefore essential to be an ashramite. For him, you could not be an ashramite without being a satyagrahi, and he thought a true satyagrahi was not a possibility if you were not schooled in the ashramic tradition, and the ashramic tradition really being the observance of the 11 vows, what he called the Ekadash Vrata. As part of your practice, you were required to be self-reflective. And how are we, given not having a language of it, not having tools for self-reflection, to actually go into the act of self-reflection? Gandhi felt that a daily diary was something essential to that practice of satyagraha. So a lot of the ashram inmates, as they were called, ashramites, maintain diaries. The grandest of them all has been Mahadev's diary. We know that 23 volumes of those diaries have been published in Gujarati. They're not available, all of them, to the readers outside of Gujarati. But Mahadev's idea was to capture the unfolding of what he called Gandhi's truth on a day-to-day basis. Each day that he spent with Gandhi, is recorded. So on a rare day that he was not with Gandhi, we do not find a diary entry. So that is the grand tradition. Manu joined, and it was actually, it was a necessary observance for everyone who went on the Dandi March. One thing that they had to do every evening was to write the daily diary. Surprisingly, only 2 of those diaries survive of the 79. So Manu is taken, and the first task that Gandhi gave her was to say, your education begins and you will start maintaining a diary. But that was not the only part of her education. She had to be formally trained. Formal training meant 3 things. Learning the Bhagavad Gita, both in Sanskrit and in translation. Not only the meaning of the Gita, but the pronunciation of the Gita. So there is textual training in Bhagavad Gita. There had to be training in English, and there had to be training in political geography. So the theater of the war had to be something that a 14-year-old Manu had to understand as to what really was happening to her world. Pyarelal became her teacher in both English and political geography. Gandhi, of course, the teacher in the Bhagavad Gita. And strangely, Manu became Ba's caregiver, but also her primary reader. She read to Ba in a systematic way. So in the act of reading to Ba, her education gets strengthened. So when we look at these diaries, which are 11 volumes of these diaries, 11 notebooks of these diaries, written primarily in Gujarati, except her English exercise notebook, which is in English, her Gita notebook, which is in Sanskrit, and the records of letters that she made. So the diaries, 11 volumes, are diaries of her day-to-day life with Gandhi, which really begins on 11th April and end on 31st January, the last entry. With, again, the days that she's not with Gandhi, there are no diary entries. So it is her day and life with Gandhi. The rest of the volumes are about her exercises, her training, the copies of letters. Now, why does Manu become important? For the public imagination, she becomes important for only 2 reasons. Very importantly, she cradled Gandhi's dying body in her arms. As he faced the 3 bullets and slumped to the ground, it was Manu who cradled his dying body. She is the witness. Also, she's also a partner in one of the most baffling episodes of Gandhi's life, what the so-called Brahmacharya experiment. Gandhi was unwilling to call it an experiment. Gandhi insisted it was a yajna. Yajna, a duty enjoined upon him, something that he could not forsake. So in the public imagination, Manu's importance has been so far that she is the witness to Gandhi's truth, the moment when he met death, and also somebody who shared in that yajna, a kind of a partner in that yajna. The first volume of the diary, which we've just published, it's here, does not deal with the Brahmacharya experiment. So if you're going to pick it up for Brahmacharya, please don't. It is really actually an account of the act of diary writing. It begins with a lot of hesitation. Day after day, she would repeat, woke up at 4:20, could not wake up. Bapu came to my bed, gave me a slap. I woke up, brushed my teeth, said the prayers. It's a kind of a day-to-day account, which is then submitted to Gandhi. Gandhi signed them every day, or on most days, when she submitted it, corrected it, her orthography. Her spellings were atrocious, even in Gujarati. Letters ill-formed. And then Gandhi would comment upon it in diaries and would insist that, she write, be more reflective. say, what did you think while you were spinning? What did you learn of the Gita today? If you played a game, what game did you play? And of course, they played badminton in the prison, carom, and something called a ring. So all these things, slowly the details begin to come in. Increasingly, Manu becomes more reflective about her relationship with Gandhi, also about the people around her. And as she begins to do that, she is less and less convinced that she needs to share the diary with Gandhi, that she needs Gandhi's authentication. So there is this conflict that goes on in Manu, whether the diary is something that should be subject to Gandhi's gaze, to approval, authentication, and that struggle really begins to form the first part of the diary. Her relationship to Gandhi, the need and the will to submit and also not to submit, to the desire to be a disciple and yet carve out spaces of autonomy for herself, and the act of diary writing. So that's one part of the story that one sees. The other part of the story that we see is it's a very tragic diary, and both sets of diaries are tragic because they both deal with preparation for death. In the first instance, Ba's death. It's actually a day-to-day account. When you read it, there's a tight knot that you feel. There's no way that you cannot be affected by this daily sense that life is ebbing out of Ba, and there's nothing that anyone can do. Right? And the tenderness with which Ba and Bapu relate to each other in those last months. The second part of the diary would again be about Gandhi preparing for his death, in a very profound way. So both diaries, in fact, speak about preparation for death. And so what you get in the first part is a narration of that life. That life in the Aga Khan is very crucial because we increasingly get a sense of Gandhi's alienation from the political culture that had begun to develop, or his associates in the political formations. Gandhi, of course, is an Aga Khan, the others are somewhere else, but the relationships, the fractures that we would see, something that Sudhir Saab wrote about, of Gandhi's akelapan, that is really is something that becomes very deeply evident by 1943. And that akelapan, that not just being solitary, not just being lonely, it's an aching kind of loneliness that he has. That is something that Manu captures through these diaries. The second part of the diaries, which we hope would be published sometime later next year, deal with the second part of her stay with Gandhi. It's 1946 December. We've erupted in a kind of a celebration of violence that nothing had prepared Gandhi for, nothing probably had prepared the people for. And Gandhi decided to retreat into Srirampur, a burnt-out village in Noakhali, and had decided that he would be accompanied by only two people, Professor N.K. Bose and Mr. Parshuraman, his typist. All the other associates are scattered over what then was East Bengal, largely the area of Noakhali, but also West Bengal. And at that point, Manu entered Gandhi's life again to provide what she thought was primary service. Now, Gandhi, N.K. Bose remarks, and N.K. Bose's My Days with Gandhi, which again deal with the same period, are remarkable because they provide insights into what was happening to that group. It was found to be so salacious or so disturbing that we know that when it came to Navjivan Press to publish it some 60 years ago, Navjivan Press decided not to publish them. they were found to be offensive, this set of reflections. I don't think, I hope that the sensibilities have changed at Navjivan, but one is never too certain about these things. So there's N.K. Bose, and there is Manu. Bose Saab tells us that Gandhi had really physically never been so alone ever in his life after the founding of Phoenix, and certainly not after he came back to India. There is just, I don't think Gandhi was ever with only 3 people. And there's actually nobody there. And it is at that period that Gandhi started on this, what he called a yajna. Everybody else, apart from him, called it an experiment, that was misguided, which was false, which was immoral, which was unbecoming of him, which was unbecoming of anybody, which was to share a bed with Manu. Now, the details of this are fuzzy, or have been. Before the yajna or the experiment began, did they share the same bed? Every one of them slept on the same bed, which meant Gandhi, Manu, Mr. Parshuram, and even Professor N.K. Bose, because there was only one room in this burnt-out Haveli which they had occupied. So sharing the bed is not, so what really one talks about is not the physical proximity of being together, but doing that with an awareness and experiment which is to be observed by both Gandhi and Manu probably is to be done. My introduction dwells on what are the possible ways in which one could understand it. One may not ever be entirely convinced about the logic that Gandhi gave. We should, for the sake of clarity, say that the experiment stopped when Manu withdrew her consent. We know about the experiment not only from Manu's diaries, but because Gandhi wrote about them extensively as they happened. He began to write about it to friends in letters, to ashram community, to people he thought had the language to understand this nature of this experiment, to those who he thought would be affected, or their political lives would be affected by the decisions that he had made. So there is that. The question that I need to ask, and I think we need to ask, is about the nature of consent, and not the nature of consent in which we pose this question. Did Manu consent to it? Yes. Is there a written consent? Yes. Was her father aware of it? Yes. Does the experiment stop when Manu says no more? Yes. None of those are, I think, the real questions that we need to ask. Those questions need to be asked. The question that bothers me about Gandhi, and which is what I will live with, and I will leave you today, is would Gandhi have consented to be part of a subject of an experiment of a woman who claimed to be celibate or was celibate and wanted an experiment in celibacy, and wanted Gandhi to be the partner in that experiment? And I'm not so certain if Gandhi would have allowed himself to be part of that experiment. I'm not certain. On some days, I think that he would have found it in himself to be that subject. On other days, I think Gandhi, knowing what we know of Gandhi, he would have made that experiment his own and then participated in it, if at all he were convinced about it. So there is this large question that we need to contend with when we read Manu's diaries. But here they are, and thank you very much, and thank you, Oxford.
Dr. Harmony.
Okay. I've said to Tridip before that I've been very scared for Manu Gandhi since I first came across her. I've always had a little bit of a knot in my stomach when I thought about this young woman. But a few days ago, after I had the opportunity to go over the first volume of her diaries, I also messaged Tridip again to say that I was just a little bit less scared. I'm still very nervous for her, but I'm a little bit less scared because she became slightly more real to me. Not because of the introduction, which I don't think made her real to me, but because you left the diaries themselves to try and make that happen. I've been very interested in walking of late. I've been thinking about walking as method, walking as act, walking as fact, especially the Gandhian walk, the many modes of the Gandhian walk. And for someone who's so preoccupied with walking, I couldn't help but be drawn to the fact that this young lady, 14 when she's at the Aga Khan Palace with the Gandhis, gets to walk with him every day. The one entry that I wanted to know more about, that sadly Manuben does not tell us about, is what happened on those walks. 7:30 to 8, if I remember correctly, on most days, they walked. I'm not sure where they went. I'm guessing it was the courtyard. I'm not sure if they walked alone. I'm not sure what they spoke about, but I do know that that was an induction and an education unlike any that this young woman or anyone else at that point could have been afforded. Because I think it was an entry point into thinking about the constructive program and rootedness and space and place and the injunction to go as far as our feet can take us and let that be the sphere of our action, which is something that I think Manuben spent the rest of her life actually acting out. What I took away from the diary is that Tridip has been onto something for a very long time, in that he's been Gandhi's accountant. Since the exercise with the Hind Swaraj, and literally an accounting exercise, when we're looking at translation, when you're looking at every single scratch, every single comma and semicolon that makes it into one edition but not another, and what that tells us about the text and its integrity. I think that accounting is clearly a part of the schema that Gandhi is inducting this young woman into, whether it is accounting for her day, because it begins with a list, or accounting for a self and a subjectivity that is slowly, achingly, and rather noiselessly coming into being. Why I started by saying I was scared for young Manu was because I've never been entirely able to make sense of how one could say either yes or no, to simplify this for a second, to a figure like Gandhi at that moment in time. If Gandhi were to ask something of you, you're in a position to respond. But what compels you to respond the way you do? And what constricts you from responding any other way? Are those positionalities that are available and open to you at all? And that is something that I'm still uncertain about, which is why I'm waiting for the second volume. But the accounting exercise, to go back to it for just a second, also revealed to me something else, which was also unsettling in some ways, which is that within this schema of caregiving, there is also the tacit understanding of care as something that is received. And this is a young woman with headaches and fevers that are upon her. It is a body that seems to be breaking in some ways. For a 14-year-old, that leads me to question why. I thought I was going to encounter a docile body when I ran into Manu. I thought that that was going to be schematic enough for me to be able to understand who this young woman was. But clearly that is something that failed and fell by the wayside exactly 1 week into her diary writing. The lists continue for exactly 1 week, Tridip, before, as you point out, she starts writing in sentences and then paragraphs and then more paragraphs, and her prose slowly begins to take shape in front of our eyes. There is something that's going on here. There is a pushback that I find interesting. The day I wanted to give her a hug was exactly, I think, 14 days into her beginning this diary, when Gandhi makes a correction in it, when she uses the term etc. to describe something that she got up to on a given day. And the notes that he sends back say, don't use the word vagera, account for what it is that you're speaking about. Her response is on the very next day to use the term etc. or vagera 3 more times. in that moment, she became real to me. In that moment, I wanted to reach out and give Manuben a hug. It was really as simple as that. There is a date on which she writes her first paragraph. And in that paragraph, she talks about how Ba had had a particularly difficult night. And she went to Ba. She was very proud of the fact that she woke up the first time that Ba called to her, and she went to her. And she was able to minister her the care that she needed. And that seemed to give her something in return. What that something is, I'm still aching to figure out the contours of, but there was something that she received in return. And she writes in that paragraph about how since she lost her mother, this is the first time that she experienced care, when Ba stroked her to sleep. Gandhi's response to this was to return her diary entry with corrections for spelling and grammar. And I think that is indicative, in some ways, of the larger role, in some weird way, that he expected Manu to one day be able to fulfill. But I wonder sometimes about what that role might have looked like had Manu had more of a say in shaping the space that she could occupy. It's one thing for Gandhi to keep saying that she reminds him of Mahadev, but it's quite another for the young woman to choose to become that person. And that I'm not left entirely certain about her wanting to occupy quite yet. I also see Pyare Lal all over young Manu. And I think it's a beautiful exercise when she begins to talk about what it is that they discuss on an evening, or how she cajoles him into giving her a story. And she becomes young and 14 to me again. When on a Sunday night she says he promised me a story on a Sunday, but he had a headache, so I pressed his head for him so that I would have my story. To me, this is perhaps what it meant to be a young person coming of age in a pressure cooker of a situation. And the fact that the ashram, as you point out for us, Tridip, in your introduction, that the ashram is not a space. The ashram is a set of practices, and therefore it is with us. It is embodied, and we carry it with us everywhere we go. And I think I'm going to end by saying that I think young Manu was an ashram, and an ashram is a space of rest. And I think she afforded that to the old man in so many ways. So thank you.
I must say that it's quite intimidating to have to be a reader and commentator on Manu's diaries in the presence of Tridip Bhai and Ashish Da and Sudhir Chandra, who are all much better acquainted, I think, than I could ever be with what Ashish Da just called the inner world of Gandhi and his associates, and better equipped to enter into that almost indecipherable space, despite this proliferation of text in the form of letters and articles and speeches and diaries and Gandhi's voluminous writings, as well as those of his ashram and political associates. The sheer volume of text nevertheless leaves entire areas of experience quite opaque. And I think it requires the kind of psychoanalytic skills that somebody like Ashish Nandi has to really be able to decode for us what is going on there. My own familiarity and my own focus has always been on Hind Swaraj, perhaps to some extent on Gandhi's engagement with the Bhagavad Gita, and really centrally on Gandhi's struggle with the idea of untouchability and his vexed relationship of intimate enmity with B.R. Ambedkar. And those are very public areas of his life and work. I think quite distant from what is going on within the ashram, within his room, within his mind, within his body, and in these intimate relationships, especially with the women folk of the ashram. So this is not an area that I really have much of a handle on, and I'm allowing Tridip Bhai's reading to guide me into this diary, which is written by such a young person that you know, it's hard to judge it in any way except with extreme empathy, as Harmony has just demonstrated. The first thing I was struck by in at least looking at Tridip's introduction, which is extensive and really worth reading, is that he is bringing to bear his decades-long engagement with the Gandhi archive, with Hind Swaraj, of which he prepared a critical edition with the late Suresh Sharma. He's bringing to bear that you know, that entire engagement on his reading of Manuben's diaries. And in a sense, this puts a lot of weight on this young woman's experience, this teenager's experience, really. And in this first volume, we only get to see what she is writing in 1943 and 44. So we have not yet arrived in Noakhali, and we are certainly not at the assassination in the period between 46 and 48. So he is, Tridip Suhrud is trying to understand what this delicate relationship between Manu and the Mahatma, you know, what that relationship has to do with an entire repertoire of Gandhian categories, which are quite developed by the 1940s, by the time Manu arrives on the scene, including the idea of the sthita prajna, of satyagraha, of swaraj, of ahimsa, of brahmacharya, all of upvas, of yajna, all of these kind of key Gandhian concepts which are fully developed by the late 40s, putting the burden or bringing the weight of them to bear on this very, very delicate, fragile relationship between this very old man and this very young grandniece of his. And really the question is, what kind of relationship is this? She's a personal caretaker, she's a daughter, she is a witness to his experiments with truth, eventually to his death. Is she a kind of muse? And of course the question which none of us will ever ask, is she a kind of lover? And really, are we even able to go in that direction with our questions? And I think Tridip's introduction goes to great lengths to avoid using that word in any way. The first thing that struck me was the Christian nature of a lot of the categories that Gandhi is concerned with, and he's trying to impart to the young Manu. Directly Christian kind of a genealogy of ideas there, with service, love, suffering, sacrifice, confession, covenant, bearing witness, self-purification, mortification of the body, poverty, chastity, celibacy. These are Christian concepts. What is Gandhi doing with them? Does using sort of the Gandhian vocabulary of equivalence, which is partly in Gujarati and partly in Sanskrit, is that really going to sort of indigenize, nativize, or you know, sort of parochialize these Christian ideas, or is that translation not happening at some deep conceptual level? That's something that we need to look at. The most interesting thing, and I'll just be very brief here, is The idea that Gandhi is relating to women and to his own sexuality by making this radical move of trying to become a woman or assert the feminine side of his own sexuality. He's acting as a mother. Mother Bapu is what Manu calls him, Mother Bapu. He is my mother, right? He says, I am a mother to you, you are a daughter to me. At the same time, she's his chosen partner in trying to control himself from his sexual urges, which he sees as an expression of the himsa or the violence in him. And the violence in the world, which includes the violence of partition and so on, far exceeding the realm of sexuality and interpersonal relationships. So the question of Gandhi's femininity, his maternal instincts, his own insistence that male sexuality is only an expression of violence and not an expression of love, right? And in order to express love and connect love and sexuality, he has to actually assume the persona of a woman. There's something extremely complicated going on here, and I certainly just do not have the vocabulary to begin to understand and decipher this. And what is the nature of consent and partnership as Tridip flags for us when the other person involved is a very, very young woman, just at the kind of beginning of her own sexuality, as it were. And we should also actually, I think, I don't know if you'll do this in later volumes, think back to what Joe Lelyveld has described as a possibly homosexual relationship that Gandhi has with Kallenbach in South Africa, well before he comes to India, right? So we should think more carefully about Gandhi's sexuality, going all the way from his femininity to homosexuality, to his very core ideas about violence and ahimsa that he is seeing as being inextricably tied to the idea of brahmacharya or celibacy and sexual self-purification and self-control, swaraj over one's self. This is not something that can be easily read or analyzed or psychoanalyzed, and certainly these diaries only complicate our understanding. They don't clarify much, to my mind. I think finally I just want to say that our discourses today of consent, of autonomy, of submission, of partnership, of the undeniable power difference, as Harmony also indicated. Do you say yes to Gandhi or do you say no to Gandhi, right? And no matter what he asks you to do, how are you going to respond to that, and what choice do you have, right? The way we today, in 2019, after Me Too and after everything that we've sort of been discussing worldwide for the last few years about the nature of consent and power in the relationship between men and women, are we in the best position really to be able to read and reflect anachronistically on what is going on inside Gandhi's ashram, inside Gandhi's family, because at the end of the day, Manu is family. I think we are coming at this from a very difficult place, and it's extremely, extremely hard. And Tridip's, the sheer size of this introduction and the sheer effort that he puts into it, I mean, indicates how much of a challenge it is for us to remain open to what we are seeing apparently going on in terms of these experiments with truth. Who's allowed to experiment on whom, right? What is the nature of power being exercised there? What kind of partnership is this? These are the key questions. And not all of Gandhi's public confessions, his announcements, his documentation, his rationalizations, his arguments with all of his peers and his associates really throw a light beyond a certain point on how we are supposed to, how exactly we are supposed to understand and empathize and stay with Gandhi's truth. So I'll just stop there and invite you to read the first part of these diaries and really look forward. Personally, I look forward far more. I think, perhaps somewhat in denial about the kind of key components of this engagement, which take place in Noakhali, when it really comes time for Gandhi to actually cohabit with Manu, jumping over that to the moment of his death. That's what I'm waiting for. That's what I'm most interested in, because he says to her, just before he dies, he says to her that I want you to be a witness to my death. And if I die, I want you to witness the fact that I died with the name of Rama on my lips. And that, in fact, comes to pass at the moment of his assassination. I mean, he's just amazingly prescient about this. She is the one who is holding him in her arms as he collapses to the assassin's bullets. And he does have the name of Rama on his lips. What is the nature of her act of witnessing? How historically momentous is it? What does it mean for her personally? That's what I'm waiting to hear about, if indeed she writes about it in her diary. But in the meantime, let us begin at the beginning, which is in 1943 and 1944, when she is locked up with Kasturba and with the Mahatma during their incarceration, during the height of the Quit India movement. Thank you very much.
Friends, let me begin with a confession. These are the days of, you have to declare a conflict of interest. Tridip is a very, very dear and old friend, and he's also my teacher. Whenever I'm faced with a problem, or whenever I need to get a fact or some information, the first and the only person I need to turn to is Tridip. Whatever little I have understood of Gandhi, and written even less, much of that is, for much of that I owe a great debt to my friend Tridip Suhrud. Now, this book, which we are discussing today, there are two parts. One is the diary of Manuben, and before that is a long, very sensitively and eruditely written introduction. Now, I'm tempted to discuss both. And in these 10 minutes, I don't think I'll be able to do justice to either. Therefore, I'll try and do something very different. This is the 150th year of Gandhi's birth, and like Ashutosh said, that's one of the reasons why we are discussing this book. And maybe that explains why Tridip, writing an introduction to Manuben's diary, devotes almost the entire introduction to Gandhi, and there is very little of Manu. Now, the question I want to raise before you is, how do we try and understand Gandhi? Not only in India, I think almost everywhere, no matter how little or how much one knows about Gandhi, everyone seems to know three basic things about Gandhi. One, his declaration that the partition of India would be over his dead body. And the failure of this man of truth to live up to his word. That's one thing we haven't forgotten. And at least in India, most of the people have not forgiven Gandhi for that. The other, Gandhi's statement on the Bihar earthquake of 1934, when he said, and I'll quote Gandhi, "I will invite you to be superstitious enough with me to believe that this earthquake is God's punishment for our great sin of untouchability." Everyone remembers this and sees this as an egregiously unscientific, anti-scientific, irrational statement. And the third is the so-called Gandhi's Brahmacharya experiment, which Tridip says rightly, and Gandhi insisted this is not an experiment, this is a yajna. Now, I dare say that on none of these three subjects, even the best minds have really tried to grapple with what Gandhi is doing or what Gandhi is saying. To my mind, two essential requirements for understanding Gandhi, for trying to understand Gandhi, the two essential requirements are, and before that I would like to say, that one is the realization, the recognition that here is an enigma, and no ordinary enigma. So we have to see that we are faced with an enigma and trying to understand something of the mystery of that enigma. And once that realization comes, the natural question would be, am I competent to deal with this enigma? And don't think I am a Gandhi Bhakt. And even if I am a Gandhi Bhakt, my first bhakti would be not to Gandhi, but for his search for truth, for his concern for truth. So I'm damned as a Gandhi Bhakt if I'm carried away by what Gandhi said without questioning what he was saying. So with this state of mind, I would say, two requirements. One is self-reflexivity and the other is humility. Why do I say self-reflexivity? Because we raise questions, for example, the question of consent. We don't quite see what are the intellectual predispositions, what are the intellectual presuppositions with which we raise the questions we do about Gandhi. For example, like this the question of consent. The mind which discusses this question of consent is so governed by Freud that any man-woman relationship must necessarily be seen in Freudian terms. Now, I want to ask, why should the Freudian understanding of man-woman relationship be taken as axiomatic? Is it really inconceivable for a man-woman relationship to be of a kind which would not admit to be analyzed in Freudian terms? I was persuaded by N.K. Bose's argument in his days, my days with Gandhi, and for years I thought that N.K. Bose was absolutely right. And N.K. Bose is offering a Freudian analysis, and Gandhi says, I have not read Freud. And it is decided that someday Gandhi would learn about Freud from N.K. Bose. The day never came. Or the Bihar earthquake statement. And Tagore, you know, led the charge against Gandhi. Charge of being unscientific and irrational. I would invite you to read the correspondence between Tagore and Gandhi. Please read for yourself. Please examine yourself in the act of examining this correspondence, and then you would see that neither Tagore nor Gandhi are actually taking a scientific view of earthquake, and both are taking a scientific view of earthquake. Both are agreed that there are certain fixed laws which cannot be violated. Both are agreed. And having agreed on this, they take ethical positions with regard to the fixity of these laws. Gandhi brings in ethics here, so does Tagore. Tagore's ethics revolves around the question of theodicy. For Tagore, it is inconceivable that he, capital H, that he can be guilty of this. And Gandhi, taking an ethical view, says, our ancestors have taught us whenever there is a natural disaster, there is something wrong with us. And we owe it to ourselves to ask, how are we responsible for that? And Gandhi goes on to say that one good thing about my argument is that even if I am proved wrong, no harm is done. And so I would make this plea, whether we accept Gandhi or we reject Gandhi or we postpone our judgment about Gandhi, let us try to be self-critical. Thank you.
I think that's a very nice note on which to end this debate. We have 5 minutes. Sorry.
Ashish, 5 to 10 minutes.
Yes, that's what I'm going to say. But what we shall do is to, we are already short over the time limit, but we will nonetheless try to take a few questions for the benefit of the speakers as well as others. Any comments for that matter, not only questions. But please be brief.
Oh, okay. I can also shout, Ashu.
So I'm Polomi Raichowdhury. So, I'm listening to you guys talk about the issue of consent. So I'm listening to you, all of you talk about the issue of consent, which is central to the story here. And I'm not convinced by the move towards complication, right? And I'm not convinced partly because at the same time that this story is unfolding, there's a very heated debate about age of consent happening. So I was wondering if any of you or all of you could comment on that this is not maybe indecipherable, even in the language of the day and in the politics of the day. So how should we interpret what is happening and what is being told through these diaries, through what is going on within the Indian women's movement, and also a much broader swath of society that is thinking exactly about the issue of how older men should or should not relate to younger women?
Two kinds of responses. One, by any notion of consent, by any understanding of the nature of power, by any notion of what constitutes a relationship between a person, a man and a woman, but also in the role of a grandfather and a granddaughter, is the experiment or the yajna justifiable? The answer is no. So if you were to ask me, do I understand or do I wish to defend the yajna? I do not think so. My question is, let's accept that it is completely unacceptable. It is, not it. Yeah. Is that the critique that we want to subject Gandhi to? I want to subject Gandhi to a greater critique, which is to say, for you, this notion of power, this notion of consent might be foreign. It need not be. What is not foreign to you is being partner in an experiment. Right? And to say that your notion of ethic, Gandhi's own notion of ethical conduct, would demand that he be willing to be part of a process that somebody else may initiate. If Gandhi is found wanting there, that vitiates the very ground of yajna or experiment. Right? I think, and that's why I said I'm not certain if Gandhi would have been ready to be part of it. If one had gone to Gandhi and said, oh, this is unethical, he would have said yes. Or maybe in this particular instance, he said, no, it's not unethical. In this particular instance, he said, no, it's not. In previous instances, other cases, he had accepted an argument saying, oh, this is not to be done, and he would say, fine. In this particular instance, he says no. I would want to read that the experiment / yajna through this question as to one, why is it for the first time in series of experiments, Gandhi is not willing to grant infallibility to himself? Saying, I could be wrong is not something that he is willing to grant in this instance. So that's puzzling. Right? Everyone goes up to him and says, you're wrong, you misguided, you've lost it, and more stronger words. It's immoral, it's actually the cause of the division of India. All these arguments are posed to him. He says, not the judgment of the entire world would convince me otherwise. So the question for me is, what is it about this particular process where he thinks that he is right? Because this kind of certainty is not something that we know of Gandhi capable of. In every other instance, even when he agreed or he finally felt that what he had done was something that needed to be done, he was open to fundamental questioning. This is the only one instance that I know where he's not open to a fundamental question. So that's what I'm struggling to do. But yes, how do you say no to Gandhi is, I mean, Harmony put it very, very beautifully. Or how do you say yes to Gandhi also?
Thank you for your question. Are you talking about the age of consent debates that we're talking about through the 1880s, etc., all the way through to 1891, when we finally revised the age of consent upwards from 10 to 12? I mean, it was a decade of fighting to raise this by a precious 2 years. This is before the full Monidasi case, but after Rakhmabai, of course. And yeah, I think it's interesting. This is not a caveat of any shape or form. But Manu is 16 or 17 by the time we're talking about Noakhali. So technically, no. I mean, she was born in 29. So by the time we get to 46, the end of 46, she's what, 17? Huh? Born in 1927. Was it 27, not 20? She's 19 around the time of Noakhali. Right. So one way or another, she's over the age of 12, which is the age of consent in British India at that point, from 1891 onwards. That was the limited point I was trying to make. But I do think that I'm tempted to agree with just kind of having to or feeling pushed to think through, and this is what stays with me, what did it mean to say yes? And what did it mean to say no? I don't know if the easy or the naturalized kind of binary that we've set up when we think about consent is something that is possible to bring into this period. So, I mean, that's as much as I have to say about that.
Ashish, maybe one more question. One more question.
I just wanted to say that having heard all this and read other things like Lelyveld and earlier than that, suggestions that Gandhi's sexuality is troubled, and one of the troubles that doesn't surface that much is his homosexuality. And I just wondered, because over time and over the centuries, homosexuality has always been cloaked under a big heterosexual umbrella. And his experiment with Manu and making it so very public and writing about it and letting the whole world ponder it is attracting attention to not his homosexuality, but perhaps his heterosexuality, which may or may not have been more troubled than his homosexuality. And I feel that nobody has ventured to look at it from that perspective. And I wonder what the psychologists or those who have studied it more carefully might make of this.
If I may respond to it, as perhaps the last comment of this session, how do you say Gandhi's sexuality was troubled when we find in our major epics the heroes have to go through a phase when they take on the incarnation of androgyny. Arjun during the Vanvas, Rama during certain moments when he breaks down into tears in mourning, and so on and so forth. One can give many examples. That journey through sexuality or bisexuality, if you like to call it, androgyny, whatever you want to call it, is a necessary identifier of the epic heroes of India. And in some epics, in the vernacular versions, that trend becomes even more pronounced. Think about it.
Thank you.
That's the end of the session with Rajni. Shivan, do you want to take over now? Thank you.
May I now request Akanksha Sivach and Amritula Muridharan to felicitate our panelists, please. Sorry, you have to wait for a small photograph. Oh, okay. So we have a charka as a souvenir for our speakers, and we have some more books.